The judge didn't hesitate. He gave her the house, the savings, everything he had built over 12 years. And then he handed him a check for $4,200 like it was enough to replace a life. That was it. No home, no backup plan, no second chance, just a quiet room, a final signature, and a man walking out with everything reduced to 2 suitcases and the weight of what he had lost. For the next 3 nights, he slept in his car, parked under dim lights, watching a life he used to belong to disappear in the rearview mirror. And if you had seen him then, you would have thought the story ended right there. Another man broken by a system that didn't leave room for second acts. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the lawyers, and certainly not the woman who walked away believing she had won, was that this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers falling apart in ways she would never have imagined. 3 years later, his face would appear on the cover of a magazine she used to leave on the kitchen counter, and in the 48 hours that followed, she called him 97 times, over and over, waiting for a voice that never came, because he didn't answer once. And the reason why is where this story gets interesting. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How does a man go from sleeping in his car, counting the hours until sunrise just to feel some sense of movement again, to standing on the cover of Forbes, his name printed in bold letters where the world can't ignore it, his story suddenly worth telling to millions of people who have never known what it feels like to lose everything in a single afternoon? What did he understand in that quiet courtroom, in that moment when everything was taken from him, that she didn't see, didn't question, didn't even consider as she walked away believing the outcome was final and complete? And why is it that after taking the house, the savings, the stability, and the version of the future they had built together, she would later become the one chasing something she could no longer reach, dialing the same number again and again, 97 times, hoping for a response that never came? As if somewhere between those calls she realized that what she thought was victory had slowly turned into something else entirely. Because this story isn't just about what was lost in that courtroom, it's about what was already in motion long before either of them realized it. And if you follow it closely, if you pay attention to the details that most people overlook, you start to see that the real shift didn't happen 3 years later when his face appeared on that magazine. It started much earlier, in decisions so small they barely seemed important at the time. And that's where the real question begins. What did he do? Why did she call 97 times? And in the end, who really won? Jordan Webb had never been the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room, not because he lacked presence, but because he didn't need attention to validate anything about himself. He was quiet in a way that made people underestimate him, disciplined in a way that made his routines almost invisible, and logical to the point where emotion rarely dictated his decisions. He worked in logistics and operations, a field where mistakes cost money and precision mattered more than personality. And over the years, he had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to fix problems before they became visible. He wasn't flashy, didn't chase status, didn't talk about success, but if something needed to be handled, he handled it. And that consistency became the foundation of everything he built. The house they lived in wasn't something they had simply bought and settled into. It was something Jordan had transformed piece by piece, room by room, over years of effort that most people would never have the patience for. He learned skills on his own, spent weekends covered in dust and paint, took on projects that others would have hired out, not because he had to, but because he believed in building something that was his, something that reflected the kind of life he wanted to create. The relationship, from the outside, looked stable, even comfortable, the kind of partnership people assume will last because there are no obvious cracks, no loud arguments, no dramatic moments that signal something is wrong. But stability can sometimes hide imbalance, and in their case, it did. Jordan built, and she benefited from what he built, not in a way that felt unfair at first, but in a way that slowly shifted over time, almost too subtle to notice when you're living inside it. He handled the finances, planned ahead, made sure everything was covered, while she moved through a life that felt secure without ever needing to question how that security was maintained. There were moments, small ones, that didn't seem important at the time, decisions that leaned slightly in one direction, conversations that ended without resolution, patterns that repeated without being addressed, and none of it felt urgent enough to confront. Looking back, the signs were there, woven into the everyday rhythm of their lives. But Jordan didn't see them for what they were, because from his perspective, they were building something together, working toward the same future, moving in the same direction. He didn't realize that while he was focused on building that future, she had already started imagining a different one where the foundation he was creating would eventually belong to her alone. By the time the word divorce was finally spoken out loud, the outcome had already been set in motion long before Jordan Webb understood what was happening. And that's what made it so difficult to process, because there was no single moment he could point to as the beginning, no argument that clearly defined the shift, just a quiet series of decisions that had been unfolding without his awareness. While he was focused on maintaining stability, making sure the bills were paid, the house was improving, and their future felt secure, she had started moving differently, not in ways that drew attention, but in ways that changed the structure beneath everything they had built. Accounts were adjusted, ownership details were reviewed, financial positions were repositioned, and each step on its own seemed ordinary, almost routine, but together they created a kind of leverage that only became visible when it was too late to respond. By the time Jordan realized something had changed, it wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a process already underway, one that didn't rely on emotion or negotiation, but on preparation and timing. The courtroom itself was quiet, almost uneventful in a way that made the outcome feel even heavier, because there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where everything exploded into something obvious and undeniable. It was controlled, structured, efficient, and in that environment, Jordan didn't react the way most people would expect. He didn't argue, didn't interrupt, didn't try to force a different outcome through emotion, because somewhere in the middle of it, he understood that the decision had already been made long before he walked into that room. The judge reviewed the details, acknowledged the positions, and then delivered a result that reduced 12 years of effort into a final distribution that felt almost mechanical in its simplicity. She received the house, the savings, the structure of the life he had spent years building, and he was left with a number on a check that didn't reflect what had been invested into creating it. He didn't lose control in that moment. He didn't break down or react in a way that drew attention. He simply absorbed it, standing there with the same quiet composure he had always carried. But what happened in that room wasn't about control. It was about loss, complete and undeniable. As he walked out of the courtroom, carrying what little remained of his previous life, there was a silence that followed him, not just in the physical sense, but in the realization that everything familiar had been removed in a way that couldn't be reversed. The house he had rebuilt with his own hands was no longer his. The routines he had relied on were gone, and the future he had been working toward no longer existed in the form he had imagined. From her perspective, the outcome was final, structured, and complete, the kind of resolution that leaves no room for reconsideration, and for most people, that would have been the end of the story. But there was one thing, one detail that didn't fit into the structure of that decision, something that wasn't listed, wasn't divided, wasn't even acknowledged in that courtroom, and it would become the one element that changed everything that came after, because there was one thing she didn't take. The first few nights after the divorce didn't feel dramatic. They felt quiet in a way that most people would find uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that forces you to sit with reality without distraction. And for Jordan Webb, that reality was simple and immediate. He no longer had a place to go. He parked his car in areas where he wouldn't be noticed, adjusted the seat just enough to rest, and waited for morning, not because it solved anything, but because it gave the illusion of forward movement. There was no sense of panic, no visible breakdown, just a steady awareness of where he was and what had changed, and that awareness became the starting point for everything that followed. He didn't spend time replaying the courtroom in his head, didn't focus on what had been taken or how unfair it felt, because those thoughts didn't move anything forward. And for someone like Jordan, forward was the only direction that mattered. Within days, his focus shifted, not toward rebuilding what he had lost, but toward understanding what he still had control over. And that's where his mindset began to separate him from what most people would do in the same situation. He started with numbers, not in a hopeful or optimistic way, but in a precise and deliberate way, tracking every dollar, every expense, every possible path that could extend his position even slightly. Planning replaced reaction, Structure replaced uncertainty, and instead of trying to recover emotionally, he focused on creating a system he could rely on, something stable enough to build from even if the starting point was lower than he had ever expected. It wasn't visible to anyone else. There were no announcements, no conversations about what he was doing, just a quiet process unfolding in the background, guided by discipline and a refusal to let circumstances dictate his direction. What made this phase different wasn't the difficulty of his situation, it was the way he approached it, because while most people would see loss and focus on what was missing, Jordan approached it like a problem to be solved, breaking it down into parts, identifying what could be adjusted, and moving step by step without rushing the outcome. He didn't look for shortcuts, didn't rely on luck, didn't expect anything to change unless he changed it himself. And that level of control, even in a limited situation, gave him something most people overlook in moments like that: clarity. While she thought the story was over, while everything appeared to have been finalized and resolved in her favor, Jordan had already shifted into something else entirely, something that didn't depend on what had happened in that courtroom. Because without making it obvious, without saying it out loud or proving it to anyone, he had already started writing the next chapter. Jordan Webb didn't approach rebuilding his life the way most people would expect. There was no rush to recreate what he had lost, no attempt to prove anything to anyone, and no emotional decisions driven by urgency or frustration. Instead, he focused on structure, beginning with something as simple and as powerful as tracking every dollar that moved through his hands. He treated his situation like a system that needed to be understood before it could be improved, documenting expenses with precision, identifying patterns, and removing anything that didn't serve a clear purpose. Because for Jordan, control didn't come from having more. It came from knowing exactly how what he had was being used. At the same time, he began studying markets in a way that aligned with his background, not chasing trends or reacting to headlines, but looking for inefficiencies, gaps, and opportunities that others overlooked, areas where his experience in logistics and operations gave him an advantage that wasn't obvious on the surface. He analyzed supply chains, distribution models, and small business operations, not as abstract concepts, but as systems that could be improved, optimized, and eventually leveraged. What separated Jordan from everyone else in similar situations wasn't just discipline. It was the way he applied it, because he wasn't trying to recover, he was trying to reposition, and that required a different kind of thinking, one that looked forward instead of backward. He didn't start over. He started smarter, using everything he had learned over the years, not just about work, but about structure, timing, and decision-making. And he applied those lessons with a level of patience that most people don't have when they feel like they've fallen behind. The first deal didn't look like much from the outside. It was small, calculated, and almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. It proved that his approach was valid, that his system could produce results, and that gave him something far more valuable than money at that stage. It gave him confirmation. From there, the progress wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen overnight, but it was consistent, each step building on the last, each decision reinforcing the structure he had created. The first real breakthrough came when he identified a pattern others had ignored, a gap in a local distribution network that seemed too minor for larger players to focus on, but significant enough to create value if handled correctly. And Jordan moved on it with precision, applying his understanding of logistics to streamline operations in a way that reduced cost and increased efficiency at the same time. It wasn't luck, it was preparation meeting the right moment, and when it worked, it opened the door to something he hadn't had since before the divorce: independence, not just financially, but structurally, because he was no longer reacting to circumstances, he was shaping them. Each small win reinforced the same principle, that progress didn't require recognition, it required consistency. And while none of this was visible to the outside world, while there were no headlines or public acknowledgement of what he was building, the foundation was becoming stronger with every step, setting the stage for something much bigger than even he had initially planned. What most people never realized, and what Jordan Webb never felt the need to explain, was that the divorce didn't catch him as off guard as it seemed, not because he knew exactly how it would unfold, but because he had started noticing changes long before anything was said out loud. It wasn't one moment, it was a pattern, small shifts in behavior, conversations that felt more calculated than before, decisions that didn't quite align with the future he thought they were building, and while none of it was enough to confront directly, it was enough for someone like Jordan to pay attention. He didn't react to it, didn't question it in a way that would create conflict, because his instinct wasn't to disrupt what was happening. It was to observe it, understand it, and prepare himself for the possibility that things might not continue the way they had. That preparation wasn't obvious. It didn't involve dramatic changes or visible actions. It was internal, a shift in mindset that allowed him to detach just enough to think clearly without being controlled by emotion. By the time the divorce process began, Jordan had already adjusted in ways that gave him an advantage no one else could see. He had started thinking long-term, focusing on what he could control rather than what he might lose, and that perspective shaped how he moved through everything that followed. In the courtroom, while the outcome looked one-sided, while it appeared as though he was simply accepting whatever was handed to him, there was something else happening beneath the surface, a decision to not fight a battle that didn't align with the direction he was already moving in. He understood that reacting emotionally would tie him to the moment, keep him focused on what was being taken instead of what could be built next, and that wasn't a position he was willing to stay in. So he stayed composed, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to think beyond that moment, beyond that room, and beyond the immediate loss that everyone else could see. This is where the story shifts in a way most people miss. Because from the outside it looks like he lost everything, like the outcome was final and complete, but the reality is more precise than that. Jordan didn't lose everything. He just lost what he was willing to let go, and that distinction is what changed everything that came after. The house, the savings, the structure of the life he had built, those were tangible, visible assets, but they weren't the source of his ability to create, to adapt, or to rebuild, and by the time those things were taken, he had already separated himself from them mentally in a way that allowed him to move forward without being held back by what was no longer his. That quiet shift, the one no one noticed at the time, is what turned what looked like an ending into a turning point, because while everyone else was focused on what he had lost, Jordan was already operating from what he still had, and that made all the difference. As the months turned into years, what Jordan Webb had been building quietly began to take on a different kind of weight, not because he suddenly changed his approach, but because the consistency of that approach started producing results that were difficult to ignore. The systems he had refined, the patterns he had studied, and the discipline he had maintained began to scale beyond small, controlled wins into something more structured and far-reaching. What started as a single opportunity expanded into multiple streams, each one connected by the same principle he had relied on from the beginning: efficiency, precision, and control. He didn't expand quickly for the sake of growth. He expanded carefully, making sure every step could support the next, and that patience created a foundation that didn't collapse under pressure. People who worked with him began to notice that he wasn't just solving problems. He was preventing them before they appeared, and that kind of reliability carries weight in environments where most decisions are reactive. With that came recognition, not the kind that arrives all at once, but the kind that builds gradually, mention by mention, recommendation by recommendation, until his name started appearing in conversations he wasn't part of. Business owners began referring others to him. Partnerships formed based on trust rather than promotion, and the work he had been doing quietly started gaining visibility without him needing to chase it. There were early features, small acknowledgments in industry circles, then broader mentions that reached beyond his immediate network, and each one added another layer to the reputation he had built without trying to be seen. What made it different was that none of it felt sudden to him, because he had already done the work, already built the structure, and what others were just beginning to notice had been in place long before it became visible. At the same time, something else was returning, something that had never fully disappeared but had been set aside during the transition, and that was his confidence, not in the sense of ego or outward expression, but in the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of producing. It showed in the way he made decisions, in the way he evaluated opportunities, and in the way he carried himself without needing validation from anyone else. He wasn't trying to prove that he had recovered. He was operating from a place where recovery was no longer the objective, growth was. As media attention began to build, as larger platforms started to take interest in the way he had approached his work and the results it was producing, The story that had once been invisible started to take shape in a way the public could recognize. And even then, Jordan didn't shift his focus, because for him, the attention wasn't the achievement, it was simply a reflection of what had already been built. The magazine hit shelves early that morning, placed among dozens of others that most people would pass without a second glance. But this one carried something different, something that had been built quietly over time and was now impossible to overlook. Jordan Webb's name sat on the cover, clear and direct, not surrounded by noise or exaggeration, just a recognition of what had already been established long before it reached that point. For anyone picking it up, it looked like a success story, a rise that seemed impressive on the surface, but what they couldn't see in those printed pages were the details that made it what it was, the discipline, the structure, the decisions made when no one was watching, and the consistency that turned small, controlled steps into something that could no longer be contained behind the scenes. His story was finally visible, not because he had pushed it into the spotlight, but because it had reached a level where it naturally drew attention. There was no moment of celebration, no dramatic reaction to seeing his own name presented in a way that the world could recognize, because for Jordan, the significance of that moment wasn't tied to the publication itself, it was tied to what it represented. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, not to the people who had doubted him, not to the ones who had overlooked him, and not even to the person who had once believed that taking everything would define the outcome of his life. It was about the fact that everything he had focused on, everything he had built step by step, had reached a point where it stood on its own, independent of the past, independent of what had been lost, and independent of any need for validation. The cover didn't change who he was. It simply reflected what he had already become. What made that moment powerful wasn't the visibility. It was the contrast, the distance between where he had been and where he now stood, not measured in time alone, but in mindset, in control, and in the way he had chosen to move forward when everything had been taken from him. 3 years earlier, he had walked out of a courtroom with a check that barely represented the life he had built, and now his name was attached to something that carried weight far beyond numbers, far beyond recognition, something that signaled a level of achievement that couldn't be dismissed or reduced. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forced, and it didn't need explanation, because it was undeniable, and for Jordan Webb, that was enough. It didn't happen all at once. It started the way most realizations do, quietly, almost accidentally, in a moment that didn't seem important until it became impossible to ignore. She wasn't looking for him, not directly, just moving through her day the way she always had, until something familiar caught her attention, a face she recognized before she could fully process where she had seen it. The magazine was sitting there in plain view, one of many, but this one held her focus longer than it should have, because the name printed across the cover wasn't just familiar, it was undeniable. Jordan Webb. For a second, it didn't connect, not completely, because the image in front of her didn't match the version of him she had left behind. The man who walked out of that courtroom with nothing, the one she believed had been reduced to a past she no longer needed to consider. But the more she looked, the more the details aligned, the posture, the expression, the presence that wasn't asking to be noticed but commanded attention anyway. What followed wasn't immediate panic. It was something slower, something more unsettling, a realization that unfolded in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. She picked up the magazine, read the headline, scanned the story, and with every line, the distance between what she believed had happened and what actually happened became clearer. The man she thought she had closed a chapter on hadn't disappeared, hadn't faded into something smaller. He had moved forward in a way she hadn't anticipated, in a way she hadn't prepared for, and that shift created a kind of tension she couldn't resolve just by understanding it. That's when the call started, not as a single decision, but as a reaction she couldn't fully control, dialing his number once, then again, each call carrying the same expectation that maybe this time he would answer. Maybe this time there would be some connection to the past she thought she understood. But the calls didn't stop. They continued, building in frequency, in urgency, in a need to reach something that was no longer accessible in the way it used to be. 97 times, over the course of hours, then days, each attempt met with the same result: silence. Not the kind of silence that feels accidental, but the kind that feels intentional, controlled, and final. For the first time, She understood exactly who she had left, not just the man he was when they were together, but the man he had become after everything had been taken from him. And in that understanding, there was no clear resolution, no simple way to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed had been decided years earlier. By the time the calls reached their final count, Jordan Webb was already aware of them, not because he was waiting for them, but because nothing in his world moved without intention anymore, and that included what he chose to respond to and what he chose to leave untouched. The number appeared on his screen more than once, then again, then repeatedly, each attempt separated by minutes, then seconds, then stretches of time that suggested hesitation followed by urgency, but his reaction never changed. He saw the name, recognized it immediately, and then did nothing. There was no internal debate, no moment where he considered picking up just to hear what she would say, no curiosity pulling him back towards something he had already moved beyond. The version of him that might have answered no longer existed, and that absence wasn't accidental. It was the result of everything he had rebuilt, everything he had restructured, and everything he had chosen to leave behind without needing closure from anyone else. From the outside, it might have looked like a missed connection, like two people separated by time and circumstance, but the reality was far more deliberate than that. Jordan understood exactly what those calls represented, not just the attempt to reconnect, but the realization behind them, the shift in perspective that only happens when someone finally sees what they didn't recognize before. But understanding it didn't mean he needed to engage with it, because his direction was no longer tied to that part of his life, and responding would have required him to step back into something he had already outgrown. So he let the phone ring, again and again, until it stopped, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity, the kind that comes when you've already answered every question that matters without needing to say a word. Not because he couldn't, but because he no longer needed to. The man she thought she had destroyed had simply outgrown the life she took from him, and in that silence, in that decision to not respond, there was a level of finality that no conversation could have provided. So let me ask you, if you were in Jordan Webb's position, after everything that happened, after walking away with nothing, after rebuilding in silence and reaching a point where the past no longer had any control over you, would you have answered the phone when it started ringing again, when the same person who once had everything within reach suddenly became the one trying to reconnect? Or would you have done exactly what he did, recognizing that some chapters don't need to be reopened once they've already served their purpose, that not every call deserves a response, and that sometimes the strongest move you can make is choosing to keep moving forward without looking back? Let me know in the comments, because every perspective tells a different story, and I'd like to hear yours. And if you thought this story was powerful, if it made you think differently about loss, control, and what it really means to rebuild something from nothing, then there's another story you need to hear next, one that might change the way you see everything even more.